What if justice could live in leather, smoothed with age, darkened by sweat, scarred by weather, yet still carrying memory? The fields of South Carolina in 1834 lay exhausted under noon sun. Dust rose in slow spirals, caught and released by wind. Silence pressed upon the rows, as taut as rope drawn tight. Windows of the overseer's house were shuttered against heat, but the echo of the whip still lingered in still air, long after its crack had faded. Before we step inside this house, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe to join this community of witnesses. The whip was never merely leather. Each lash carved itself onto bodies and into memory. Each crack was a word, uttered without tongue, commanding obedience, reminding of hierarchy. The sound carried beyond skin, beyond the row punished. It carried through the quarters, through generations, written into silence itself. When braided strands whistled down into the soil or onto a post, they struck not only flesh, they marked the ground. Every space bore witness, dust unsettled, air shuddered, silence torn. But objects, remember. The whip itself bore wear from countless strikes. Grips softened where fingers clutched too tight, leather edges frayed where force had been greatest. It carried sweat, oil, dust. It carried memory of every hand that lifted it, every back it marked. And so the question remains, could the whip turn? Could the instrument of pain, once emblem of control, become vessel of retribution? Could it whisper vengeance, coiled tight, waiting for moment and hand to guide it otherwise? The silence around the fields gave hint of answer. Silence is not emptiness. It is presence, watching, storing, pressing. On that land, silence was stretched taut from cornstalk to house porch, from shuttered windows to cracked soil. Silence carried weight enough to break, if guided. In 1834, 4 men heard that silence, felt it coil with them. Together, they waited. And the whip, mute and hanging, waited as well. The plantation stood not as grandeur, but as imposition. Summer heat clung to its structures, damp swelling timber, thickening air. Barns leaned heavy with corn, iron hinges sagging from their doors. Latches, dulled by damp yet resolute, held the grain in confinement. Corn husks dried in heaps, whispering dry songs when stirred by wind. The smell of oil clung to iron, mingled with the grain's sweetness, stitched together in humidity so thick it coated skin. Every breath was grain and sweat, oil and dust. Ledgers attempted to order this expanse. Across a wooden desk, ink scrawled in columns, bushels harvested, hours tallied, names reduced to marks. Pages smudged where overseer's sweat dropped in heat, smears hiding as much as they revealed. Still, the book carried its own authority, its own weight, as though truth itself was bound inside its stains. Between the barn and the quarters, ground was rutted with barefoot tracks. Furrows in the soil testified to passage repeated day after day. The ground remembers. It knew which strides were hurried, which slogged under strain, which staggered after blows. The soil bore silent witness to labor and punishment alike. The corn crib stood as sentinel, filled, aired, guarded. Its planks absorbed the breath of those it contained, creaked in the night with settling grain. Hinges shrieked on opening and closing, announcing movements even under cover of darkness. Nothing passed unheard. Every hinge betrayed. The fields stretched wide, but within them enclosure was absolute. Every doorway, every latch, every weight of grain spoke of surveillance and possession. Even silence itself served as prison walls, binding all within its reach. For the 4 men who labored under this sky, each structure carried memory. Barns retaining the echo of shouted orders, cribs storing the sounds of crying muffled beneath boards. Doors closed, with hinges scarring into ears, tethering laborers to duty. The overseer believed these structures eternal. Grain would continue to pour in, ink to flow, latches to clamp, ground to rut with footsteps. But the ground had been listening, the barns remembering, the corn cribs storing more than corn. And when silence grew too heavy, the hinges would cease to protect. They are unnamed in the ledger. 4 marks, 4 entries, stripped of biography and condensed into figures. Yet memory restores them, not with detail, but with presence. They were men of patience, of stillness. In the fields, sweat darkened linen at their waist, cloth folded and tied, absorbing every exertion. Their breaths were slow, not wasted, drawn deep under the sun, released in rhythm with the corn rows. Count the steps, count the stalks, count the hours. They learned survival through counting. Stillness was not passivity. It was cultivation. Each glance exchanged beneath the overseer's eye was message enough. Eyes carried weight of lashes endured, stripes remembered, pain transmuted into resolve. They did not need words. Their ink was hidden where no ledger could rewrite it. Under shade at noon, in hush of evening, silence grew thick as cloth. In that silence, resolve hardened. Folded cloth at their belts, sweat ingrained, became tokens of endurance. Corn rows marked time like sand in an hourglass, and within they waited, patient as seeds buried beneath ground, waiting their own appointed season. Their waiting was not empty. It was filled with memory, with witnessing of cruelty repeated. Their stillness concealed accumulation. When silence pressed heavy, they knew it could also be wielded. 4 men unseen, uncounted properly, yet inwardly counting, steps, rows, lashes, breaths, waiting until silence summoned answer. The overseer was not careless in punishment. He was deliberate, calculated, each act staged to assert dominion. Whip cracked not just against flesh but against the air itself, sentence pronounced without jury. His boots ground into soil with authority, particles rising with each step like dust reluctant to settle. He planted himself before witnesses, establishing theater of pain. Tobacco smoke curled from his lips, settling into creases of his coat, steeping him in its bitterness. The whip cut air with violence, sharpened into ceremony. Each crack tore silence deliberately. He ruled as conductor of pain's orchestra. Posts in the barn bore leather scars where he had practiced or punished without restraint. Wood itself carried traces, scored deep and silent. Every lash was meant to outlast moment. Bruises faded, but memory did not. Neighbors knew. Enslaved men and women knew even deeper. Silence after punishment held echoes loud as thunder. This cruelty, this ritual, was his scripture. He read authority from open wounds, inscribed fear upon silence. The overseer repeated this rite, with liquor souring his breath and commands souring the ears of all within range. To him, silence was weakness. To the 4 men waiting, silence was strength. He had staged his rituals so often they became pattern, and every pattern was a map. What could be mapped could be undone. Omens came to those who looked for them. In dusk light, a crow circled high but would not land, its caw harsh, echoing faint through humid air. A lantern, lit by the barn door, sputtered, flame trembling, though oil was plentiful. In the overseer's ledger, numbers blurred under sweat dripping from hand, tally marks smeared into almost illegibility. Grain stalks whispered in breeze, sounding like cloth rubbed dry, carrying murmurs through the rows. Names, warnings, rumors sifted from mouth to mouth as wind moved through field. Even those who did not speak of rebellion sensed timing awaiting. Little signs layered meaning onto silence. Everything unsettled. Omen is what language people give to unease. Fields became stage for portents, silent yet insistent. Cracks in power revealed themselves first in body. The overseer's step faltered on porch boards, unsettled boots striking with uneven rhythm. At night, his coughing filled the dark, cloth pressed to lips until fabric dampened with sweat. Doctors summoned offered theories. Swamp fever, they said. Spoiled meat. Air too dense with damp. Physicians tapped thresholds with polished canes, pronouncements heavy but uncertain. Remedies provided little more than distraction. Bitter tonics, bleeding, compresses. His breath remained staggered. At night, lamps burned uneven. Flame leaned, guttered, smoke curling into rooms, scent pressing into cloth. Servants counted hours by coughs, each attack measuring time like pendulum swings. Counting became ritual, unspoken, yet exact. To quarters, this was not happenstance. This was sign. Disease could not be trusted as mere accident. Some whispered affliction, carried message. Silence now wrote itself upon skin rather than ledger. He who once wielded whip with measured violence now struggled against judgment he could not see, hand invisible as air. The overseer staggered, yet ritual continued. He punished still, though weaker, each act less certain. Silence after each crack extended longer, press heavier. In shadows men listened, not to power made loud, but to its faltering decline. Decision does not arrive with horns or drums. It arrives like dusk, the slow dimming of light until shadow claims everything. For the four men, tokens shaped that decision. One kept a split length of cord, knotted twice, not as marker, not as vow. Another carried a shard of hinge lifted from the barn door, iron rough in palm, cold reminder that even locks can be broken. Corn stalks folded into cross shapes lay tucked into belts, crackling faintly when moved, transformed from crop to emblem. These were not weapons. They were reminders, binding ordinary into ritual. The tokens whispered silently. The hour approaches. The time was chosen by season. Corn cribs swollen from harvest bore witness. Fields stripped spoke of labor complete. The air carried ripe dusk smells, dust, grain, sweat, faint rot. A moonless night sealed the choice. Darkness without aid of silver sky meant concealment, meant silence deeper. Before movement, breaths were counted. One breath for each life scarred, another for each lash endured, another for names unrecorded yet felt. Counting was more than patience. It was sharpening. The hush before their step was unlike any quiet before. Silence stretched, pressing down like heavy cloth. No dog barked, no owl cried. Even the corn rows seemed to listen, stalks rigid in still air. Inwardly, the men bound themselves to pact, not with words, but with repetition of tokens, with pressure of hinge shard in hand, with knot in cord checked twice, with crackle of folded stalks. The overseer's decline had marked the season, but the real marker was silence itself, transformed now from burden to force. When harvest yields are full, barns sealed, cribs packed, a season has concluded. They chose their season likewise. Night folded itself around the barn. Darkness was thick, grown dense from absence of moon. Crickets hushed suddenly as if withholding approval. The overseer walked with swagger intact, whip coiled at side like serpent asleep. His boots dragged faintly against soil, rhythm of power dulled but stubborn, as though denying his own frailty. The four shadows aligned themselves, still as posts, silent as boards of crib itself. each breath measured. When moment broke, it was without spectacle. Motion swift, but sound contained. Each strike counted inwardly, rhythm turning violence into ritual. The whip never cracked that night. Silence cracked instead, torn against timbers creaking as if testifying. Night air pressed heavy with musk of grain, sweat, iron. Each man marked his blow not on overseer alone, but on ledger of history woven tight in silence. It ended with hush, heavier than before. The body fell unceremonious to earth beneath corn crib. Dark soil received weight without protest. Above, grain shifted faintly, settling deeper, muffling all. Rustle of stalks outside answered with tremor, breeze whispering faint. Crib timbers creaked as though acknowledging new burden. The four stood a moment longer, listening as if silence itself required confirmation. Then footsteps shifted, counted away into night, soft but deliberate. To each man, number of steps marked another entry on unspoken ledger. No boast exchanged, nothing shouted. Only silence pressing doorways shut. Sealing act inside. The ground received all. Memory sank into it. Soil absorbing truth paper would refuse. Grain above, soil below. Overseer enclosed in silence. Word traveled but bent as it went. Whispers grew distorted, stripped of names. Some said illness claimed him. Others murmured rebellion. None spoke certainty. Officials came, raindrops pooling at courthouse steps. Quills hovered, then blotted mid-stroke. Entries abandoned. Ledger resumed neat lines. Overseer's name reduced to absence. Silence served as shield. Absence itself becoming verdict. Neighbors voiced speculation, but no one wished truth sharpened. Safer to invoke discipline. Safer to invoke God's will. Safer to quiet the fields than acknowledge reckoning. Sun rose over corn rows at dawn. Silence there thicker than mist. Rose looked unchanged, yet the ground remembered. Decades later, artifacts surfaced faint as smoke. Whip found coiled in attic trunk. Cracked leather said never to sing again. Children whispered the rhyme of 4 in the night, though no adult confirmed source. Farmers claimed corn cribs groaned when harvest moon rose, sound like boards sighing in memory. Archivists penciled notes in margins, then erased or had them erased. Footnotes bent away from certainty, yet faint marks endured ink's removal. Around fire, tales unrecorded burned low, retold with shifts and omissions, but always circling reckoning. The whip in the trunk became a symbol. The rhyme on the lips of children became an archive. Oral fire carried where ink faltered, passing ember to ember. Hinge rusted deep in soil, but soil preserved truth better than page. The tale does not end, it lingers. Not with ink, not with verdict, but with presence. Corn crib timbers sigh when wind presses against them. Boards creak at night, though barns stand empty. A whip lies coiled in dust, leather silent as bone. Silence itself has weight, heavier even than grain. Was justice answered, or deferred, distorted, unfinished? The question circles like a crow refusing to land. Reckoning breathes without announcement, inhabiting ground, pressing doorways, glinting half-seen in memory's corner. The 4 men remain unnamed in records, yet silence names them still. Their act is not a spectacle to recite. It is memory folded into hush. The ground remembers, and in its remembering, silence resists forgetting.